Margaret Walsh had been hearing the same sound for 20 years, light scraping and digging sounds coming from her neighbor Harold's garden every night. Harold claimed it was garden maintenance, but one night, Margaret saw Harold burying something in his garden, and the next morning, Harold's wife, Alice, had disappeared. Margaret Walsh had lived at 47 Elm Street in the quiet suburb of Millbrook, Connecticut for 38 years. At 73, she was what neighbors politely called observant and what others less charitably described as nosy. Margaret preferred to think of herself as concerned about her community's well-being, though she admitted that retirement had given her perhaps too much time to notice the comings and goings of her neighbors. The tree-lined street had been Margaret's home since 1985, when she and her late husband Robert had moved there as newlyweds in their 30s. They had chosen the neighborhood for its safety, excellent schools, and the kind of close-knit community where people looked out for each other. Over the decades, Margaret had watched young families move in, children grow up and leave for college, and older residents gradually downsize or move to assisted living facilities. Number 45, Elm Street, the house directly next to Margaret's, had been home to Harold and Alice Morrison since 1997. Harold was a quiet man in his mid-60s who worked as an insurance adjuster, while Alice had been a cheerful woman about the same age who worked part-time at the local library. They had seemed like ideal neighbors, quiet, respectful, and always willing to help with small favors, like collecting mail during vacations or lending tools for yard work. Margaret's bedroom window faced the Morrisons' backyard, separated only by a low fence that Robert had installed years ago to mark the property line. The window provided an unobstructed view of the Morrisons' garden, which Harold maintained with what seemed like obsessive dedication. Even in the first years after they moved in, Margaret had noticed that Harold spent unusual amounts of time working in his yard, often continuing well into the evening hours when most people had retired indoors. The strange sounds had begun in 1999, approximately 2 years after the Morrisons moved in. Margaret first noticed them during a bout of insomnia following Robert's death from a heart attack that spring. Grief and loneliness had made sleep elusive, and she often found herself lying awake in the dark, listening to the quiet sounds of the suburban night, distant traffic, the occasional dog barking, the hum of air conditioning units. But sometime in late summer of 1999, a new sound had joined the familiar nighttime symphony. Beginning around 2 a.m., Margaret would hear what sounded like careful, methodical digging coming from the Morrisons' backyard. The sounds weren't violent or hurried, but rather patient and deliberate, the scrape of a shovel against soil, the soft thud of earth being moved, occasional pauses that suggested someone was taking care to work quietly. Initially, Margaret had assumed Harold was simply doing some late-night gardening, perhaps preparing new flower beds or dealing with some landscaping project that was easier to tackle during the cooler nighttime hour. Many dedicated gardeners preferred to do heavy digging in the evening to avoid the heat of summer days, and Harold had always been particular about maintaining his yard's appearance. However, as weeks turned into months, Margaret began to find the consistency and timing of the sounds unusual. The digging always occurred at roughly the same time, between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., and always followed the same pattern. It would begin with the sound of footsteps on the stone path that led from the Morrison house to the garden area, followed by what sounded like tools being arranged, then the careful, methodical digging that could continue for an hour or more. What made the sounds particularly puzzling was their regularity. Harold seemed to be digging in his garden 2 or 3 times per week, regardless of weather conditions or seasonal considerations. Margaret had observed him working during rain, snow, and freezing temperatures, conditions that would typically make gardening both unpleasant and ineffective. Margaret's curiosity about the nighttime activities intensified in October 1999, when Alice Morrison suddenly disappeared. The circumstances of Alice's departure had been the subject of neighborhood speculation for weeks. According to Harold's explanation to concerned neighbors and local police, Alice had simply left him. She had taken some clothes and personal belongings and moved out while he was at work, leaving only a brief note saying she needed space to think about their marriage. The story had seemed plausible enough to most residents. Marital problems were common, and Alice had sometimes seemed stressed or unhappy during neighborhood encounters in the months leading up to her departure. She had mentioned to several neighbors that she was feeling overwhelmed by work and personal responsibilities, and some residents recalled that she and Harold had been having occasional arguments that were audible from their yard. However, Margaret had found several aspects of Alice's disappearance troubling. Alice had been a creature of habit, who took great pride in her work at the library and her relationships with regular patrons. It seemed unlikely that she would abandon her job without giving notice or explaining her situation to her supervisor. Additionally, Alice had been planning the library's annual Halloween fundraiser and had seemed excited about the event just days before her disappearance. Most significantly, Margaret noticed that Harold's nighttime digging activities had intensified dramatically in the days immediately following Alice's departure. What had previously been a 2 or 3 times per week routine became an almost nightly occurrence, with Harold spending even longer periods working in his garden during the dark hour. Margaret had mentioned her observations to several neighbors and had even contacted the police with her concern. However, her reputation as someone who paid perhaps too much attention to other people's business had worked against her credibility. The police had investigated Alice's disappearance perfunctorily, noting that there were no signs of violence or struggle, and that Harold's explanation was consistent with what appeared to be a voluntary departure. Mrs. Walsh, Officer David Chen had explained patiently during one of Margaret's visits to the police station. People leave their spouses every day. Without evidence of foul play, there's really nothing we can investigate. Mr. Morrison isn't obligated to explain his gardening habits to anyone. Over the following months and years, Margaret's concerns about the Morrison situation gradually evolved from active worry to persistent unease. Alice Morrison was never seen again in Millbrook, and Harold's explanations for her continued absence became increasingly vague. He told different neighbors different stories. Sometimes Alice was staying with family in another state. Sometimes she was traveling. Sometimes she was simply taking time to figure things out. Meanwhile, Harold's nighttime gardening routine continued with remarkable consistency. Margaret documented the sounds in a journal she began keeping in early 2000, noting the dates, times, and duration of the digging activity. Over 20 years, she accumulated hundreds of entries describing the methodical sounds coming from next door. The pattern was remarkably consistent. Harold typically began his work around 2 a.m. and continued for 1 to 3 hours. The sounds suggested he was using various tools, shovels, picks, and what might have been a small mechanical device like a rototiller or electric cultivator. The work seemed to focus on different areas of the garden on different nights, suggesting either a systematic approach to landscaping or the deliberate concealment of whatever Harold was burying. Margaret's observations became more detailed and specific as years passed. She noted that Harold's activities seemed to intensify during certain seasons, particularly autumn and spring when ground conditions were optimal for digging. She also observed that the sounds were often preceded and followed by what appeared to be careful cleanup activity, the scraping of tools, the movement of what might have been tarps or plastic sheeting, and the sound of water being used to wash equipment. Despite the consistency of her observation, Margaret found it increasingly difficult to convince anyone else to take her concerns seriously. Harold Morrison maintained his reputation as a quiet, law-abiding neighbor who kept to himself but caused no trouble. He continued working as an insurance adjuster, maintained his property meticulously, and interacted politely with neighbors when circumstances required social contact. The few times Margaret had attempted to discuss her suspicions with other residents, she encountered skepticism and gentle suggestions that she might be misinterpreting innocent activity. Harold's garden was undeniably beautiful and well-maintained, featuring elaborate flower beds, decorative shrubs, and a small vegetable garden that produced impressive yields each growing season. Maybe he's just really passionate about composting, suggested Janet Miller, who lived across the street. Some people get very scientific about soil preparation and organic gardening methods. Or maybe he has insomnia and finds gardening therapeutic, offered Bob Harrison from 2 houses down. Lots of people have trouble sleeping as they get older. Margaret understood these explanations were more reasonable than her growing suspicion that Harold Morrison had murdered his wife and buried her remains in his backyard. However, 20 years of consistent observation had convinced her that something was fundamentally wrong with the situation next door. The breakthrough came on a stormy night in March 2024. A severe weather system had moved through Connecticut, bringing heavy rain, strong winds, and minor flooding to the Millbrook area. Margaret, now 73 and dealing with arthritis that made sleep even more elusive than usual, was lying awake listening to the storm when she noticed that Harold's routine nighttime activities were continuing despite the harsh weather conditions. Through her bedroom window, Margaret could see Harold working in his garden with a flashlight, apparently unconcerned by the rain and wind that were making conditions miserable for anyone venturing outdoors. The sight struck her as particularly unusual, because Harold had always seemed to be a practical person who would typically wait for better weather before undertaking unnecessary outdoor work. As Margaret watched from her window, she saw Harold carefully uncovering what appeared to be a tarp-covered area near the center of his garden. The The storm had apparently exposed or disturbed something that required his immediate attention, regardless of the weather conditions. Harold worked methodically for nearly an hour, occasionally stopping to check his surroundings and ensure he wasn't being observed. The next morning, as Margaret surveyed the storm damage in her own yard, she noticed that Harold's garden showed signs of significant disturbance. Areas that had been carefully cultivated and planted were now torn up, with soil scattered by the wind and rain. More significantly, Margaret could see what appeared to be fragments of white material protruding from the disturbed earth in several locations. Her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and dread, Margaret realized that the storm had finally provided the evidence she had been seeking for 20 years. The white fragments looked like pieces of bone or other organic material that had been buried beneath Harold's meticulous garden maintenance. Margaret faced a difficult decision about how to proceed with her discovery. Her previous attempts to interest law enforcement in Harold's activities had been unsuccessful, and she worried that her reputation as an overly curious neighbor would once again work against her credibility. However, she also recognized that this might be her only opportunity to finally prove that her suspicions had been justified. After careful consideration, Margaret decided to document the evidence thoroughly before contacting authorities. Using her late husband's digital camera, she took dozens of photographs of Harold's yard from various angles, focusing particularly on the areas where white fragments were visible. She also prepared copies of her 20-year journal documenting Harold's nighttime activities, organizing the entries chronologically to demonstrate the consistent pattern of suspicious behavior. When Margaret finally contacted the police, she spoke with Detective Sarah Rodriguez, a newer member of the Millbrook Police Department who was unfamiliar with Margaret's previous reports about the Morrison situation. Detective Rodriguez listened to Margaret's explanation with professional attention and agreed to visit the Walsh residence to examine the evidence Margaret had documented. "Mrs. Walsh," Detective Rodriguez said as she reviewed Margaret's photographs and journal entries, "this is quite extensive documentation. You've been watching your neighbor's activities for 20 years? "I know how it sounds," Margaret replied defensively, "but I was convinced something was wrong from the beginning. Alice Morrison wouldn't have just disappeared without telling anyone where she was going." Detective Rodriguez studied the photographs carefully, paying particular attention to the white fragments visible in Harold's disturbed garden. "These do appear to be bone fragments," she agreed, "but they could be from animals, pets that were buried, or even bones from meat preparation that were composted." "For 20 years, Margaret asked. "Harold has been digging in that garden regularly for 2 decades. That's a lot of dead pets or kitchen scraps." The detective's expression grew more serious as she considered the implications of Margaret's observation. "You're right that the time frame makes innocent explanations less likely. Let me discuss this with my supervisor and see what kind of investigation we can authorize." Within 48 hours, Detective Rodriguez returned to Elm Street with a team of forensic specialists and a court order authorizing the search of Harold Morrison's property. The legal process had been expedited due to the potential presence of human remains and the extensive documentation Margaret had provided supporting her claim. Harold Morrison was not home when the search team arrived. He was reportedly attending a work-related conference in Hartford, but the court order allowed investigators to proceed without his presence. Using ground-penetrating radar and other specialized equipment, the forensic team began a systematic examination of Harold's backyard. The first significant discovery came within hours of beginning the search. Approximately 3 feet beneath the surface of Harold's prized rose garden, investigators found what appeared to be human skeletal remains wrapped in degraded plastic sheet. Additional excavation revealed more bone fragments, personal jewelry, and scraps of clothing that had survived decades of burial. As the investigation continued over the following days, forensic anthropologist Dr. Emily Chen worked to reconstruct the remains and determine their identity. Dental records and DNA analysis eventually confirmed what Margaret had suspected for 20 years. The bones belonged to Alice Morrison, who had been murdered and buried in her own backyard sometime in late 1999. The condition of the remains suggests they've been buried for approximately 24 to 25 years, Dr. Chen explained to investigators. The cause of death appears to be blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with being struck by a heavy object. Additional discoveries in Harold's garden revealed the scope of his deception over the year. Investigators found evidence that Harold had been systematically moving and redistributing Alice's remains to prevent their discovery, explaining the regular nighttime digging activities that Margaret had observed. Different sections of the garden contained bone fragments from various parts of Alice's skeleton, suggesting that Harold had been carefully managing the burial site to avoid detection. The investigation also revealed that Harold had been collecting Social Security and pension benefits in Alice's name for over 20 years, using forged documents to maintain the fiction that she was alive but living elsewhere. Bank records showed regular deposits and withdrawals that Harold had been making from accounts opened in Alice's name at various financial institutions. When Harold Morrison was arrested upon his return from Hartford, he initially maintained his innocence and claimed that Alice had indeed left him voluntarily in 1999. However, confronted with the physical evidence and Margaret's detailed documentation of his activities, Harold eventually confessed to killing his wife during a domestic dispute and burying her remains in their backyard. "She was threatening to leave me and take half of everything," Harold told investigators during his confession. "We got into an argument and I hit her with a baseball bat. I didn't mean to kill her, but once it happened, I panicked and tried to cover it up." Harold's confession revealed that he had spent the subsequent 20 years living with the constant fear of discovery, carefully maintaining Alice's gravesite and periodically redistributing her remains to prevent their detection. The regular nighttime activities that Margaret had observed were part of Harold's ongoing effort to manage the burial site and ensure that no evidence of his crime would be discovered. The case attracted significant media attention, both for the persistence of Margaret's observations and for the length of time Harold had successfully concealed his crime. Legal experts noted that the case demonstrated the importance of paying attention to seemingly innocent but unusual patterns of behavior and the value of civilian observations in identifying potential criminal activity. Mrs. Walsh's 20 years of documentation were crucial to solving this case, Detective Rodriguez explained to reporters. Without her careful attention to detail and her willingness to persist despite initial skepticism, Harold Morrison might have continued to get away with murder indefinitely. Margaret Walsh became something of a local celebrity following Harold's arrest and conviction. Neighbors who had previously dismissed her concerns about the Morrison situation now praised her persistence and attention to detail. The case was featured in several true crime documentaries and magazine articles, highlighting the importance of community vigilance in identifying and reporting suspicious activity. For Margaret, the resolution of the Alice Morrison case brought a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. She was gratified to finally have her suspicions validated and to know that Alice's family would finally have closure about what had happened to their daughter and sister. However, she also felt profound sadness for Alice, who had spent 20 years buried in her own garden while her killer continued to live freely just yards away from where he had concealed her remains. Harold Morrison was ultimately convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The extensive evidence of his systematic deception and the premeditated nature of his efforts to conceal the crime convinced the jury that his actions constituted more than a momentary lapse in judgment during a domestic dispute. The Morrison house was eventually sold. The new owners completely renovated the property, removing Harold's elaborate garden and installing a swimming pool in the backyard where Alice's remains had been buried. Margaret found some comfort in knowing that the site of Alice's suffering had been transformed into a place where a new family could create positive memories. At 73, Margaret Walsh continued to live at 47 Elm Street. Though her experience with the Morrison case had taught her to balance her natural curiosity about neighborhood activities with respect for others' privacy, she still kept a journal of her observations, but she focused more on positive community developments, like new families moving in, children learning to ride bicycles, and neighbors helping each other with various projects. The Alice Morrison case had demonstrated that sometimes the most unlikely observer can provide crucial insights into serious crimes, and that persistence and attention to detail can ultimately serve the cause of justice even when initial reports are met with skepticism. Margaret's 20 years of careful documentation had not only solved a murder case, but it also provided closure for Alice's family and ensured that her killer would be held accountable for his actions. For Margaret, the most important lesson from the experience was that paying attention to the world around you isn't just about satisfying curiosity. It's about being a responsible member of a community where people look out for each other and speak up when something seems wrong. Sometimes the difference between justice and impunity depends on one person's willingness to notice, remember, and refuse to give up on seeking the truth.